Simon Weaver, Global Head of ESG Advisory at KPMG, which has two key parts to the role. First is around how do we ensure as KPMG we embed sustainability into every piece of advice we give our clients, whether that's a transaction, whether it's around strategy, or even around cost out. How do we ensure that sustainability is at the heart of our advice? And secondly is around working with our largest clients on what is a huge challenge of delivering on the net zero goals, but also the much broader sustainability ambitions that we all have. This morning, I wanted to cover three things. Firstly, why is sustainability such an important topic for everyone in this room? Secondly, why does it feel like executing on our sustainability plans is maybe becoming more difficult rather than easier? And then finally, how can we collectively continue to build on the momentum we've got from the last few years to really help our boards, our owners and our consumers make the change that we need to make in the next 5 years and beyond? So starting with why is this so important for us all? Just a few statistics that many of you will already know, but the UK hospitality sector currently produces 15% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, for those in the know, you'll know that there are 60 to 90% of those emissions that are Scope 3, and I'll come on to that a bit later. 8 million tonnes of CO2 and equivalents from the sector comes from energy use. In hotels and pubs, over 50% of that is from heating and lighting alone. We also have the issue around food waste, with 1 million tonnes of food waste produced by the sector each year and having a huge impact on carbon emissions as well. Now, over the last 7 years, we've delivered on significant reductions. But in general, those have often been the low-hanging fruit. And actually, as we look forward to 2030 and look at it from a UK perspective and look at our nationally determined contributions that we've committed to, we need to double the pace of decarbonisation that we've seen in the last 7 years. So it's not a small task by any stretch of the imagination. So then if we come to why is this so difficult? Well, ultimately, it's about change, but systemic change. No one company, no one sector, not even one country or one continent can deliver on the change that we need to deliver as a global society over the coming years. Now, anyone who's tried to run a change program, whether it's at work or even at home, trying to change behaviours at home, will know just how hard it is. And that's why it's really important that we work together to deliver on this collective change. Now, to simplify it down, there are three main groups that we need to get working much better together if we're going to deliver on the net zero ambition. Firstly, policymakers, and Kate talked a lot about the government in her opening remarks. Secondly, around consumers and customers. And then thirdly, us, the corporates. Now, if we put the customers first, as we always should, working with one hotel company recently, we found that although an ever-increasing number of customers will say they want to do the right thing, when it comes to the decision point, price and other factors such as luxury actually become much more important than those sustainability decisions than they may say in the surveys that many of you, I'm sure, will share with them. But we are starting to see a shift in what's expected. In a recent survey we did, 50% or over 50% of consumers said they would change their behaviours because of people actually misstating their green ambitions and not delivering on what they said they would deliver. And 1 in 5 said they have actually changed their decisions around a certain company and stopped buying from certain companies because of that issue. But I have a question for us all in whether we're underestimating our customers if we see them as consumers. I was recently recommended a book called Citizens by John Alexander. I don't know if anybody has read that in the room, but it focuses on how if we start to think and act like citizens, we'll have a much better chance of delivering on the net zero ambition. And I haven't got to the end of the book. I was only recommended it a couple of weeks ago. But as I've read through the book, it's made me really think about how I and my clients see our customers. And in the past, I've always seen them as consumers rather than citizens. But actually, is there a potential positive change in behaviour and perspective if we see our customers as citizens instead? Now, whether you see them as consumers or citizens, they're not going to solve the problem on their own. And as Kate said, policymakers are absolutely crucial to delivering on our net zero ambition. But can we rely on them? Well, in short, if you look over the last 3 years, the answer's no. But hopefully, as Kate said, at least in the UK, with the green reforms that are coming, there is some hope in terms of the new government and what they're looking to do around the green agenda. But I wouldn't hold too much hope for them delivering on all the challenges that we've got ahead over the next few years. I ran a session last year where we brought regulators, government officials, corporates, and also NGOs into one space. And the reason I did that is when I speak to all of those stakeholders individually, they all point the fingers at each other. I said, well, let's get in the room and have a conversation. There was actually even swearing in introductions as people pointed at each other, mostly at the government. Now, in the first break, one of the senior individuals from DESNZ who was there came up to me and said, Simon, I'm really confused because the corporates seem to be asking for regulations. And we're constantly told that corporates want less regulations. And I said, well, they don't want more regulations around disclosures. They want more regulations that help them drive policy action. And as Kate said, this is why it's so important that we all focus on advocacy, both individually and collectively. I don't envy politicians, and I'd never want to put myself in that position. But unfortunately, we can't rely on them to take that long-term view that we need for many of the things that we'll talk through this morning. They're often too responsive to the public's here and now views, and we as corporate leaders instead need to help steer them in the right direction. And we do have the opportunity to do that, as Kate said, through advocacy. So that leaves us as the corporate community. Now, we should be hugely proud of the progress we've made over the last few years. If I look back 5 years ago, the conversation I was having in boards, both in your sectors and other sectors, was as simple as, what is climate change? I'd go to the board one day, I'd then go to my children's junior school the following day and have a very similar conversation about climate change. I'm delighted to say that's changed. It's a much more informed, educated conversation that I have with boards today. Now, when did that change? If you don't mind looking back 3 years, COP26, you may remember Alok Sharma's emotional speech and also the now King's call to action of all of us. And looking back on that time of COP26, it makes me realise that as corporates we do, or at least did, really respect what the government told us. And partly that's probably as we came off the back of COVID and felt like we were much more obedient beings than maybe we are 3 years on. But COP26 was coined the business COP because it was the trigger for a flurry of net zero ambitions, both within this sector and across the broader market. But if we're honest with ourselves, at that point, we didn't really know what we were letting ourselves into. And in many ways, the last 3 years have been a journey of discovery. Now, we've made some pockets of great progress. There's one statistic over the last few years, the number of companies in the UN-backed Race to Zero has grown by 59%. But fast forward to today, and many of the things you'll discuss today, there's many challenges in the hospitality sector and beyond that we haven't cracked, whether that's heating, whether it's the continued demand for gas cookers, not to mention the geopolitical environment we face ourselves in for those that are global companies in the room today. And that's why 3 of the words I hear being discussed more and more around the executive table are greenwashing, green hushing, and green wishing. Now, many of you will have heard, particularly the first one, greenwashing, the act of making false or misleading statements about the environmental benefits of a product or practice. But green hushing has become a much more relevant topic, which is around where a company tries to downplay or hide certain positive things it's doing around the environmental society due to the criticism or backlash that it may get. And then finally, we have green wishing, where a company absolutely hopes to meet certain sustainability commitments, but simply does not have the wherewithal to do so. Now, the worrying thing about this is all about how do we tell the right story, rather than what we're doing. But we need to continue our focus on green action. Now, the issue is that if a board is accused of greenwashing, it can have huge implications, both for the collective organisation, but often more importantly, the individuals that sit on that board. And that's why, as a result, my biggest worry is that boards are starting to see their net zero target as a threat versus a challenge. And that's a really dangerous place for us to be in terms of starting to see it as a threat versus a challenge. Net zero is something we can't lean out from, and we all need to continue to drive for that change. So to come to the important bit, how can we collectively drive that momentum? Well, ultimately, we need to lean in rather than lean out. And often that can feel like the harder thing to do. Many chief sustainability officers I meet with say that I feel like I'm having to think further ahead than the CEO. And it's constantly a battle of challenge in terms of trying to justify the return on investment of the actions that we're putting forward. But leaning in is hard because also we've done the easy wins and now it's the hard stuff that we've got to present to the board. But we need to prioritise and, really importantly, not let perfection get in the way of progress. One FTSE 100 chair said to me recently, I feel like we spend our whole time debating the things that we have no control over. That's why the way I talk to companies now is really focused on what are the things that you can control and influence. Some of you will have come across the Transition Plan Task Force guidance that talks really about control and influence, and then the other things that you monitor, but just recognise that you can't take action on at the moment. Two reasons for doing that. Firstly, it removes the often emotional link to Scope 3 emissions, but also it really enables us to focus, because often trying to achieve everything, and anybody that's doing CSRD reporting will know at the moment, if you try and do everything, you often won't achieve anything. And it's really important to have that prioritisation. So before I go into a few examples of things that I see companies doing and plays into the rest of the discussions you're having today, I just wanted us all to stop and reflect now on what are the emissions that you've got within your company? What are those that you really feel you control? And what are those that you feel you can influence? And ask yourself, are you doing everything you can to reduce these as fast as commercially possible? Now, I think that's a really hard question. If I think of it from a KPMG perspective, I'm really challenged in terms of, yes, we're doing lots, but absolutely there's more that we can do. And when we say about being commercially positive, that doesn't mean that there's a return in 1 year. Often that will be a return on investment that may not come for 2, 3, or even longer years. So what are some of the things that my clients are doing, but also which from the agenda, many of which you're going to discuss in more detail today? The first one, and for me this is the one that we all absolutely have to do, is the adoption of low emission energy sources. Now that's either choosing an energy provider that has 100% renewables, but even better, as I believe BrewDog is doing at the moment, investing in a new bioenergy plant to fuel its operations and recycle byproducts. Now, more and more as corporates, it's brilliant if we can increase the low energy capacity, both in your communities, but also in the country. It's the corporate equivalent of putting solar panels on your roof at home. And it really does make a huge difference if we can all do it. The second one is greener building practices. So from an energy efficiency perspective, through smart energy management systems, and also sustainable building materials. So looking to source greener concrete, or upcycle furniture where relevant within your business. But also low carbon products and services. A question for all of you. I'm sure in many of your organisations, if not all of them, you've got R&D teams. Are the R&D teams faced into those questions about sustainability, both as a standalone issue, but also as part of every conversation they're having about research and development? We then get to some of the levers that sit between control and influence. And influence is always an interesting debate in terms of how much influence you have, for example, over consumer choice. Two questions I'd have here for you is, are you doing what you can to drive sustainable behavior through your advertising? Now, this is a tough one in the sector because often it can feel, especially when you're presenting it to certain executives, that it's a trade-off with growth. But done in the right way, it absolutely can meet both of those. And secondly, are there things you could do, for example, in product labeling, to bring sustainability more to the front mind of your customers, like airlines do with emissions on flights or calories in food menus? And then the final one is around supply chain. Now, the supply chain is absolutely crucial. Firstly, in terms of the principles you have around your supply chain, but also the way that you're engaging with them. Accor's guiding principle, From Farm to Work, focuses on traceability and shortening its value chain to increase transparency and resource efficiency. You cannot underestimate the importance of engaging with the supply chain as well. For example, Whitbread launched a partnership with Cotton Connect, investing in farming communities in Pakistan to promote sustainable agricultural practices. Now, some of these, as you look at them, particularly energy efficiency, for example, can drive cost reductions too. But it's really important that we're not just delivering on those items that will deliver cost efficiencies in the next year, because if we don't, then we will be simply too late in terms of the targets that we need to deliver on. So just to conclude, we as leaders in the hospitality sector have a hugely important role to play if you think back to those statistics at the beginning and the level of control and influence we have over this topic of sustainability and net zero. Without doubt, we've made great progress, but the change in pace needed over the next 5 years to 2030 and then beyond won't just happen. We can't rely on policymakers or customers to do our job for us. So we need to focus. We need to focus on the things we can control. We need to focus on the things that we can influence. And possibly, as I noted, focusing on seeing our customers as citizens, not just as consumers. And the final thing I'll say is we need to be honest. We need to be honest around the position we're in. We need to be honest around the challenges we face. And ultimately, we then need to collaborate. And that is why it is brilliant that you're all in the room today, that it's oversubscribed, because these are the moments where you have conversations about the challenges you're facing, and ultimately we'll find much better solutions as we work as sectors together and cross sectors. And thank you very much for inviting me.